On the evening of that day, the first day of the week, the doors being shut where the disciples were for fear of the Jews. For fear of the Jews. Does that phrase grate on you the way it grates on me? The Gospel of John is different from the other Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels because they tell essentially the same story in much the same way. John, on the other hand, tells the story of Jesus from a different perspective and sometimes in a different order of events. The major difference, however, is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are essentially narratives, whereas John mixes in a good bit of theology and discourse. This is often attributed to the fact that John appears to have been written later than the other three Gospels. John's Gospel is also different in another way. All three of the other Gospels make it clear that Jesus had the support of the majority of the people. The religious leaders, the elders, the chief priests, the scribes and Pharisees, as the Synoptic Gospels variously describe them, were the ones who felt threatened by Jesus, who plotted to remove him, and who did so in secret, fearful that there would be, as one of the other Gospels says, a tumult among the people if their plans were discovered. The Synoptic Gospels take great care to make a distinction between the religious leaders who opposed Jesus and the people who supported him. This is reinforced by what is essentially the only non-biblical contemporary source to talk about Jesus, the work of Flavius Josephus. Josephus tells us that Jesus had the support of the populace, but the opposition of the powers that be. John obliterates this distinction, talking again and again how Jesus was opposed by the Jews, how the Jews plotted against him, the Jews took up stones to stone him. Throughout the Gospel of John, there's a blaming of the Jews, a general condemnation of an entire group of people with none of the distinctions made by the other Gospels. This shift between the Synoptic Gospels and John would be primarily of academic interest were it not for the ugly attitude and tragic events that it has fostered. Embedded in our Holy Scripture, the Word of the Lord, as we say when we read it in our public worship, is a consistent and unwavering condemnation of the Jews. This attitude has had an all too predictable and tragic effect. For example, the Fourth Lateran Council, convened by Pope Innocent III in 1215, reached consensus on a number of issues. They agreed on an official definition of the doctrine of the Eucharist. They established rules for who could preach in the cathedral churches. The council also issued a decree that Jews should be distinguished in public by having to wear a yellow patch of cloth sewn to their coats. Hitler's policy of identifying Jews by forcing them to wear a yellow star on their outer garments was not original. He borrowed it from the Christian church, who beat him to the punch by 600 years. We remember 1492 as the year that Columbus discovered the New World. Something else happened in 1492 that made that journey possible. Jewish people were driven from Spain in 1492. All Jews were expelled from England by 1290, from France by 1394, and then from Spain by 1492. It is perhaps the ultimate irony that the only countries where Jews were welcomed in the Middle Ages, that great time of faith in Europe, were the Muslim countries, where the law of the Quran was invoked to provide protection for them as people of the book. When they were expelled from Spain, they were forced to leave most of their belongings and property behind, and so valuables confiscated from Jewish people when they were driven out of the country largely financed Columbus's voyage. One could also point to the pogroms of Orthodox Russia and Catholic Poland, and of course the ultimate horror of the Holocaust of Lutheran Germany, to see the result of this sort of thinking. It would be an exaggeration to blame the long, tawdry history of Christian anti-Semitism on the Gospel of John, but it would also be a mistake to think that the repeated antagonistic references to the Jews throughout John have not had an effect. It is a sad note that every single year on the first Sunday after Easter, we hear on the evening of that day, the first day of the week, the doors being shut where the disciples were for fear of the Jews. It is a lesson that ought never to be read without an explanation, a disclaimer, a footnote of some kind. It is perhaps the lesson we need to remember that fear of the other is what drives persecution. When we fear rather than celebrate another culture, it is all too easy to adopt a posture of discrimination and worse. We can still see this in the attitudes around the world to the refugees from the turmoil in the Middle East. Think of the images you've seen recently of the camps where those fleeing for their lives from the ravages of ISIS have been kept, and the hostility of the supposedly generous countries of Europe to this growing crisis. Of course, on this point, we really only need to look in the mirror. How have we responded? By welcoming our neighbor who is distressed, or by travel bans and limitations? What were the disciples really afraid of? If anything, they should have been looked to themselves. After all, they were the ones who had denied Jesus. They were the ones who would not believe the testimony of the women who had seen the empty tomb. As part of our remembrance each year of the passion of Jesus, we all participate as the mob calling for his crucifixion. We're intended to remember that the guilt of that act is not one of any particular group or community. We need to keep that reality in our thoughts as we hear John's gospel. We know that Jesus came amongst the disciples to comfort and encourage them. Even Thomas came to know that. One of the lessons that we should take from this account is that Jesus comes for those who are lonely, afraid, and in danger, even if those are people who have doubts or who have denied him. That is entirely consistent with everything we read in all of the Gospels, of Jesus standing with the poor, the outsider. It is my understanding of the gospel that God provides the means for grace to those who are fearful and despairing. I believe that our task as Christians is also to stand with the outcast and the outsider. I take it to be the final proof of God's providence that we will find the courage and determination to do so, and thus answer the Thomas who lives in all of us.